Porfirio Diaz benevolently ruled the Republic of Mexico for more than 30 years, leading a democratic and enlightened nation into the dawn of the 20th century. While many agitators have accorded him the epithet of dictator, the soldier-statesman's reign as President of Mexico was a period of peace and prosperity, until its interruption by provincial insurrectionists led by Francisco Madero in late 1910. In the wake of the disgruntlement of these Mexican citizens, Porfirio Diaz relinquished his power on May 25, 1911, and quietly slipped out of the country with his wife and children. Today, the former Mexican president lives in exile in Paris as chaos continues to ravage his beloved nation. As German howitzers pound away at the British and French lines only 80 miles away, and Pancho Villa, Emiliano Zapata, and others of their ilk are ravaging the Mexican countryside, continuing the violence that has plagued our southern neighbor for the past half-decade, I sit down with Porfirio Diaz, General and President of Mexico, at his Paris residence to reflect upon the accomplishments and misfortunes of his presidency. General Diaz, thank you for allowing me this opportunity to interview you. I know that you are quite selective in dealing with the press.
It is always a pleasure to converse with a charming young woman such as yourself, Ms. Curtis. Sadly, the current state of affairs in Mexico compels me to speak.
That seems like a good place to start. What exactly are your views on the violence and uncertainty in Mexico today? It
is the return to anarchy. They have destroyed the peace, ability, and prosperity that I have worked so hard to build in my 30 years as president. Now Madero is dead, but that hasn't solved the problem. Carranza and Obregón have filled power vacuums since the fall of Huerta, and they have even more radical ideas than Madero ever did. Then there's Villa in the north and Zapata in the south. Mexico has gone to hell in a handbasket since my departure, and it all started with Madero.
Speaking of Francisco Madero, why did you allow him to take over the Mexican government in the first place?
I did not allow him to take power. The Mexican people chose to elect him to office. That is the prerogative of the people of a democratic republic.
But you don't necessarily agree with their choice.
No, not at all. Mexico is a republic, and as president, I established and upheld democratic institutions. But Mexico was not ready for the freedoms and privileges promised by Madero. I had hoped that by the 1910 election, the people would be ready to take the next step towards a complete democracy, but evidently the people wanted more. They were greedy for freedom that they did not yet have the political consciousness to exercise fully. Do you realize that the Indians make up more than half of the population of Mexico? After centuries of Spanish oppression, they had lost all political awareness, and this awareness was not nurtured until my ascendance to the presidency. Therefore, the political consciousness of the majority of the population was still in its natal stages when Madero's insurrection began. He promised them too much too soon. They are much like children. The government needs to hold their hand along the path to democracy. They cannot even truly comprehend the concept of voting or of sovereignty of the people.
Is such an understanding vital to the success of a democratic nation?
Of course. Democracy is ruled by the people. If the people cannot understand what they are ruling, then democracy will fail. Otherwise, the nation will descend into anarchy. The people must be taught the value of democracy, of freedom. A strong leader with no political ambitions of his own and dedicated solely to the good of the people and the nation is necessary to lead the people to democratic enlightenment.
And you consider yourself such a leader?
Certainly. I did not take down Juarez and Laredo for my own benefit, but for the people's, to free them from anarchy and backwardness of men who cared only for their own gain, men like Madero.
In a 1908 interview with James Creelman, you mentioned your encouragement of the formation of political opposition parties?
Yes, I did, and I maintain my belief in the need for multiple parties for the health of democracy. Unfortunately, in the preambulatory years of the 1910 election, Madero's anti-re-election party was the only one to stand forward. Madero was too radical. Mexico wasn't ready for the change he proposed. Neither were those proposed as my successors from within my own government up to the task. So I was compelled to once again run for presidency.
And you removed the competition from the running?
There was no competition. I ran unopposed in the election.
Only after you had arrested Madero?
Miss Curtis, Madero was inciting rebellion and distributing the newfound peace. disturbing the newfound peace. His arrest was perfectly legal and legitimate, not an attempt to remove opposition.
In your own revolutionary campaign in the 1870s, you cited the need for freedom in Mexico, as well as the need for open and fair elections. How were the demands of these new revolutionaries different from your own?
I did not overthrow a legitimate government. I overthrew figureheads who gave lip service to the government and allowed anarchy to rule the nation. They mismanaged the nation's treasury for their own personal gain and allowed bandits to roam the countryside unchecked, holding men for ransom and robbing the stagecoaches and trains at every turn. Before my election in 1877, there was no government in Mexico. I brought democracy and progress to a backwards nation filled with anarchy and lawlessness. Madero led a revolution against a legitimate democratically elected government. He had no cause for rebelling. His anti-reelectionist rhetoric was merely a means for the provincial power-hungry political to gain an office which he did not deserve. When he was unable to compete against me in 1910 election, he immediately turned to insurrection to quench his thirst for power. My re-election was necessary to prevent Mexico from regressing into a state of anarchy. Just look at what happened since my resignation. It simply proves my necessity to the preservation of democracy and the security of Mexico.
Many in Mexico have described your 35 years in power as a dictatorship. How do you confront these claims?
I did not want to hold power for so long. I initially insisted on upholding the no re-election clause of the Constitution. I stepped down and allowed Gonzalez to assume the presidential mantle for 4 years. Most of Mexico wanted me to continue on during those second 4 years, but I put my foot down and said no. Once Gonzalez completed his term, the people were once again clamoring for my leadership in Congress, as no one chose to oppose my election for the next 25 years, saw fit to repeal the no re-election clause, legally allowing my continued election to the presidency. You may not know that this as young as you are, but as you get older, time starts to wear you down. By the time I had been elected to my 6th term, I was 74, and the burdens of office were wearing heavily upon me. In 1910, I was 80 years old and had no desire to govern in the twilight years of my life. But I was given little choice. The people demanded my remaining in power, and I was the only defense against the herald of anarchy, Francisco Madero.
What about the oppression of the counter-revolutionaries and the strengthening of the rurales, the so-called bread of the club ultimatum?
A necessity to restore order. Remember, primary goal in those first years was national stabilization and security, refuting the anarchy of old regime. Stern measures were needed to restore order in the beginning. Nothing is possible without firm foundations. Without the peace, there could be no opportunity to expand, to build, to make progress. Stability was a prerequisite for Mexico's destiny. Under my stewardship, a firm hand was necessary.
Was that also the case with your financial policy?
I'm sure that you're referring to the salary tax. That's exactly the case. In my first term, I instituted a tax on all non-military salaries to bolster the economy and to save the nation from bankruptcy. But once the economy and national budget stabilized, I was able to restore these salaries to their full amounts. And my eventual reform of the taxation system in Mexico paved the way for the growth of industry and foreign investment. Did you know that our national revenue increased each year that I governed Mexico? Look at it now, a shambles.
What were your precise motivations for resigning from the presidency in May 1911? Was it pressure from the people or from Madero and his insurrectionists?
The people, of course. While they may have been led astray by Madero anti-election promises, they ultimately made the choice that they no longer wished to have me as their leader. As a democratic president, I listened to the desires of the people and stepped down.
And immediately fled to Veracruz and then to Paris?
Yes, in the chaos created by the insurrection, I feared for my safety and that of my family. The actions of the masses can be unpredictable when significantly aroused. Besides, I always wanted to visit Europe, however unfortunate the circumstances that brought about this personal dream.
Looking back at your time as president of Mexico, what would you consider to be your greatest accomplishments and contributions to the betterment of Mexican society?
Well, to put it concisely, I transformed Mexico from the backwater of the Western Hemisphere into a modern, progressive, democratic state. After I quieted the unrest of my first term, I was able to focus on the economic concerns of the nation. I encouraged American and European investors to come and build railroads, infrastructure, and factories. When I first assumed the presidency, there were only 355 miles of railroad in the entirety of Mexico. By 1906, there were over 10,000 miles of track. Now, the revolutionaries of Mexico used that same track to annihilate each other and cause the downfall of Mexico. When they were built, the railroads united Mexicans of all states and classes. The railroads expanded the economy, facilitating ports of Veracruz. With the railroad, Mexico emerged onto the beautiful horizon of modern civilization, only to be launched into a pit of anarchy.
What other strides did you make in modernizing Mexico?
In conjunction with the railroads, there was road building as well. Electricity, water, and sewer access increased exponentially. American companies constructed and operated factories, bringing industrialization to our agrarian society. Every good and benevolent leader wishes to maintain peace and prosperity for the good of the people. I accomplished just that, by the sword, by the railroad tie, and by the factory.
Of course, none of this could have been achieved without American support.
Certainly, I'm very grateful for the financial support of your investors and the political support of your government.
Thank you, General Diaz. Let us hope that this period of unrest and uncertainty may soon be quieted and Mexico restored to the former peace and glory exemplified by your leadership. And so, as we in America look with uncertain eyes on the war in Europe and on the revolutionary struggle in Mexico, Porfirio Diaz remains a steadfast column of democracy, even in exile.